Okay, thanks everyone. Here we go. We are now in the fourth part of our agenda for today, and this is really the meat, so strap in. We are really going to dig in here together. This is where we start to engage in small group discussions to do the work of identifying what is known and what isn't known from research about empathy and conservation. But before we do that, we thought it might be useful to model some of the ways that those group conversations could happen, drawing on what you heard from these 5 researchers in the lightning talks and drawing on your own expertise and experience, right? So we're going to do a quick fishbowl. I'm sure all of you have been part of a fishbowl at some point. Of course, it's a teaching strategy that occurs when a small group of people engage in discussion and they are the fish, and when the rest of us are outside of the fishbowl and we are really listening and reflecting and observing, okay? So our fish today, those people who are in the bowl, are Jim Wharton and Kathayoon Khalil, both of whom you've met, as well as Wei Ying Wong, who is the Assistant Director for Science and Technical Assistance at Washington's Sea Grant. So I'm going to ask the 3 of you to engage in, I don't know, maybe 3 to 5 minutes. We'll check in and see. Conversation focused on this prompt. Thinking about what we just learned across these 5 lightning talks and thinking about your own experience and expertise. Summarize some things that you think we can say about what is known and what is not known from the research on empathy and conservation. Jim, Kathayoon, Wei Ying, is that clear enough? Are you okay to get started? Yeah? Awesome. I'm going to turn it over to the 3 of you. Take it away. Have fun.
Great. Thank you, Jessica. I think one of the things I heard, and I know that it's a common theme in empathy, and I'm going to jump in the deep end a little bit here, but is this idea of similarity. At the Designing for Empathy Summit, which is a few weeks ago, this came up as well as both sort of one of the strengths of empathy, and that it helps us see connections with animals, but also one of perhaps the dangers of empathy in that it overemphasizes value in similarity. Have you all, if either of you had a chance to think about some of the, I mean, we talk about empathy as a universal positive, but there are sort of concerning aspects to empathy, things we should be conscious of.
That's interesting. Are you thinking that like focusing on similarity stigmatizes difference?
I think that, yeah, that's where I'm going with that. That the idea that we put such a high value on these similarities in order to create this feeling of empathy that it somehow devalues differences.
No, that makes sense. I'm just trying to think about it. That's a good, because I feel like when we are highlighting the similarities, we're also saying that our similarities are more important than the differences, right? That there's that thread to it too, not just look for all the similarities that we have, but prioritize and respect those similarities above the fact that we recognize, of course, that there are differences, but those are not as important. So I wonder if that's one angle that might make it a little more palatable and might not lead us down some of those like deep, dark alleyways.
I think that's a really fascinating question, because I also think that for me, it harkens back to this whole narrative of, you know, and I'm going to go right there, right? I'm going to jump right there into the political space of really thinking about, you know, all lives matter versus, you know, in that space. How much does it put us in that risk of articulating similarities and burying the nuanced differences that does somehow uniquely make this interesting and complicated? And so, but I do agree with you. I think there is an importance in really kind of shaping this and playing up the similarities, but as with all things for us, I think, you know, really thinking about how do we walk that fine line where, because the difference is just as critical, right? So I think it's really kind of fascinating.
Well, some of this goes towards our like deeply ingrained human behavior, right? As saying like, you are similar to me, like if I, help you, then it helps genes that are similar to my genes to continue on in this universe. So that's really interesting thing too to think about.
But it also in some way it's interesting, it immediately contradicts the very value that we say about biodiversity, right? Which is this all things that are different, and the difference makes us stronger. But let us really focus on that which is similar. Yeah, so it's kind of an interesting perspective.
I think it's a tension we just have to hold, right? It's not a reason to abandon the idea of emphasizing similarity, but I think it's a like I said, like that tension to hold.
And I think it harkens to this idea that I've been reflecting on while listening to these talks about the immense loneliness that exists when you are a human being in the universe, right? Like, I'm not talking about like I'm alone in my house, but like this the idea of human exceptionalism being tied to the construct of loneliness, and how empathy can start to deconstruct that loneliness and help you see unity amongst creatures, right? So that it's not so it's not so solitary to be a human.
Yeah, I like the idea that Dr. Horowitz brought up that yes, finding those similarities with animals can make me feel even more exceptional and special, right? Yeah. Like that I have these things in common with these beings that I admire so much.
Yeah. I have a question that I want to pose, thinking about what Jerry said about like changing behavior versus maintaining behavior. So thinking about behavior a lot lately, because we spent all this time, right, thinking about behaviors we wanted to, or actions we wanted to change and behaviors we wanted to sustain. And then all of the infrastructure, all of the, supports for that kind of fell away in the midst of this world-changing traumatic pandemic. And so is it, if we are looking forward, I don't think this is what Jerry was saying, but I want to, is it so bad to just be maintaining behaviors because there are going to be external pressures that are going to try and dismantle some of those behaviors or try to challenge them? So should we focus on sustenance, right, over the creation of the new, especially right now when we're in this phase of change, and that is not just going to end the moment this all ends, right?
Yeah, I'm going to interrupt there. I'm sorry.
No,
I'm sorry. I hate interrupting awesome conversation, and I hope that we will have another chance to hear you all continue. Thank you so much for doing that. Can we just quickly pull out some and identify some strategies that you heard Jim, Kathayoon, and Wei Ying using in their conversation? Let's use the chat. Tell me one thing you observed about that conversation.
Sure.
Or if you want to talk, was that someone who wants to talk? No, I got excited there for a second. Yeah, Heather says it was very collaborative, right? So they were taking turns. Meg says they posed questions to spark discussion, right? And very clearly labeled it that, like, I want to pose a question about this. Reagan points out active listening, absolutely, mutual respect. Each observation was turned into a relevant question for the group. Yes, clarifying things. Are you saying this? Are you thinking this? Using a nugget from a presentation. Yeah, so I really liked it when Jerry talked about this. What do we think about that? Those are awesome. I noted all of those things too. Johnny says reasoning out loud by repeating what was said earlier, right? Love that. So I encourage you all to make use of those strategies in the small group discussions that are about to happen. And revoicing. Thanks, Jeannie. All right, I'm going to spend 2 or 3 minutes telling you what we're about to do. Are you ready? Everyone take a deep breath. Here's where the rubber hits the road. In a few minutes, someone from the aquarium is going to send you an invitation to join a breakout room within Zoom. Okay, in case you haven't used Zoom's breakout rooms before, what's going to happen is you'll see a window pop up on your screen, and it'll ask you if you want to join a breakout room with a particular number or name. You'll say yes or join or whatever the positive response is, and you will be automatically transported in Harry Potter fashion into this other room with your small group, where you will then be able to talk. When it's time to come back out of your session, you can do one of two things. Either you can click leave. So when you're in a breakout room, you have two options: leave the whole entire meeting or just leave your breakout room. If you do the latter, you will automatically be taken back into this main session. Alternatively, you can wait until the timer goes down. So you'll receive a countdown at 2 minutes, letting you know that you've got 2 minutes left. And if you just wait that out, Zoom will automatically bring you back to here, okay? Each breakout room is going to have sorry, I'm also trying to manage discussion about these breakout rooms. Hold on. Each breakout room is going to have maybe 5, 6, 7 people in it. All right. I'm going to suggest that you all introduce yourselves again, just so that you can know each other a little bit better. And then the prompt that you're going to work towards is, what do you think is known and not known from research on empathy and conservation? Some of you might identify things that you've heard others talk about here today. Some of you might identify things from your own research, from your own practical experience. Any and all apply. Okay, the logistics. Sarah, I need you to unmute since I saw a text from you. Would you recommend that we try to make sense of concept board and use it here, or do you think we should abandon that and do something else?
I love the flexibility. So we had created, or I should say Jessica, created 20 separate sort of editable note-taking whiteboard spaces for each small group to work in. We, during some of the earlier presentations, Marta and I reached out to many of you to see if you would populate the link to your group's concept board in your breakout room. So what we're kind of asking you to be is to be sort of a messenger, you know, tucking away this link and carrying it with you into your room. Okay. You might find that it's difficult to copy and paste out of the thing that we sent you. In which case, I think that if you have any trouble getting to concept board, abandon it. Take notes in some other way. Google Doc, piece of paper, anything like that.
Okay, awesome, Sarah. I'm going to quickly show you concept board by sharing my screen. It is basically a virtual whiteboard. I've been using it in some of my classes as a way to create a shared experience that we are all really wanting right now. And so this looks a little bit different than what will happen for you, but basically you, hold on, let me just see if it'll Sarah's gone in and done some work in these. So here we go. So what'll happen is you will get a link to concept board. It'll ask you to enter your name and agree to some sort of user regulations, and then you'll be taken directly to your board. Okay, so this is Group P's board. You can see the prompt in there, and then you can use these tools up top here to write. You can use this sticky in order to place a sticky note and write on it. You can use text to just create a text box and write. You can use the this tool to draw some stuff. You can do whatever you want. We just thought this might be a useful way to capture and archive the brainstorming that's happening across all of these groups. Again, if concept board doesn't work for you within 30 seconds, you abandon it, creatively come up with some other way to take notes within your group, and we will work with that. Okay. Let me just see if there's anything else I wanted to tell you. You will have 30 minutes in your small groups. Then when we come back, we will take a break, and then we'll start the process of sharing across those groups to see if we can identify some patterns and trends that will take us into tomorrow. Phew. All right, let me pause there. Can you all use the chat to tell me what questions you have about what I'm proposing we do here? What doesn't make sense in there? Heather says, good to go. Thank you, Heather. Anyone else? Will you tell me either you feel okay about this or you've got some questions? Thanks, Lisa. Thanks, Stephanie. Thanks, Jim, Emily, Rosalio, Aaron. Okay, sounds like we're good. Ready to try it, right? I mean, we're going to experiment here. Most of 2020 has become a large experiment, hasn't it? I really appreciate your willingness to lead into this and to figure out how to make it work. I'm going to say one last thing, and that is many of us in this Zoom meeting don't know each other. And I have found, if you're me and you're a bit of an introvert, I have found that breakout room discussions can be a little bit anxiety producing, more so than when I'm in person. I don't know why. I don't know. My daughter says it's because you're staring. She feels like everyone's staring at you like this while you talk, which isn't a normal social dynamic. I feel like sometimes it's because of the awkwardness that happens, right? We can't like talk over top of each other and like really sort of build bonds that way. And so some of that can get, it can just feel a little bit awkward. And I want to just point that out, name it, and say it is okay to feel a little bit awkward. Let's just do our best to push through this. Everyone feels that same way. And we'll see if we can find some productive ways of engaging. While you're in your breakout room, if you need any one of us for technical help, for conceptual help, for anything, there's a little call for help button that you can use, and it'll let us know and we will pop in, okay? Give me a physical thumbs up if you're ready and good. Awesome, thanks everybody. Okay, so Sarah, I need you to, or Marta or Becky, I need you to remind us now. Will a breakout room invitation be sent now? Yeah.
Yes, I think it should be coming. You are the host, so
Yeah.
if you go down, yep.
Yep.
I think it's coming. Click it.
Yeah. So you're ready for me to click open all rooms?
Yes.
Yes.
Woohoo! Here we go. Let's do a little bit of reflecting first on this process. Use the chat and tell me what excited you most about your group's conversation. Tell me one thing that excited you about your group's conversation. For those of you who are just coming back, we're using chat to identify one thing that we thought was exciting in our group conversation. Excuse me, outside perspective, yeah. Positive empathy, generative, variety of perspectives, deep thoughts, collaborative, mix of practitioners and researchers, curiosity, hearing things we'd never heard before, sharing similar stories, learning about other people's work, curiosity, synergy. This is amazing. I love it. Now, in the spirit that nothing is perfect, tell me one thing that was challenging for you about this conversation. One thing that was challenging about the conversation. Direction. Yeah, I hear that. It's hard to all be pulling in the same direction, right? Given this variety of perspectives. Awkward to start. Oh, I hear that. I think part of that is Zoom. More time. I know, still so much we don't know. Not having the answers. Yeah. Yep, so I see time, a little bit of social awkwardness, maybe having a group leader might have helped. I appreciate that suggestion. Hard to ask questions without knowing, right? So if you think back to our introductions, many of us admitted that we're learners in this situation. And so that makes this task perhaps challenging for us. Awkward pauses in conversation. Yeah. The other day, I have two teenagers who are going to school in my house, and my daughter is in 7th grade. She was walking around the house the other day with her laptop in front of her, just staring at it. And I said, "What are you doing?" And she said, "Oh, I'm in a small group discussion." So, well, why aren't you talking? Oh, she said, "None of us are talking. We're just staring at each other." It's like, okay. I mean, again, I kind of get that, right? You feel a little like you're in 7th grade in some of these breakout rooms. Not solving every problem. Yep, totally. Reminding ourselves how much we don't know. Rabbit holes. Rabbit holes are such a thing, Nettie. Okay, so speaking of rabbit holes, now we got to figure out what to do here. In my mind, what makes sense, and I'm going to look for pushback from all of you, but what makes sense now is to try to synthesize across these groups in the best way we can. It's not going to be perfect, but to try to grab up from the groups your main ideas and somehow put them together in one place so that tomorrow, when we start again, we can use that foundation as our point for then having conversations about research directions, right? So when Sarah and I talked, we sort of thought about this in terms of this first exercise is about mapping, right? Just about laying out the landscape. And that the next exercise tomorrow then is about topography, right? Identifying those peaks, those places, or the valleys where there's gaps in research, but really identifying those places where we think research is important. And then the third conversation might be about prioritizing, right? So sort of setting direction to play that metaphor all the way out and figuring out which of those research ideas might be most important and why. Are you all with me on that general way of thinking? Yeah,
Jessica,
okay.
could I chime in for just a moment?
Please, Sarah, jump in.
I'm really struck by one of the things that I feel like came up in our group a little, and I saw in a number of the comments in the chat, was something that I think Fatima put into words, where she said lack of collective background on empathy research. And I will note that one of our goals, we recognize that for this conference to accomplish the goal of sort of collectively mapping the known landscape of empathy, sometimes that happens through like a formal literature review or a landscape analysis, and that wasn't necessarily how we were structuring this conference. That said, we do have a wealth of really research-based knowledge in this space today, and I wonder if there's a way we could tap into some of that, maybe if we are kind of pulling out big ideas or these sort of claims that we can make about empathy. I wonder if we could invite many of you who have that academic research experience to help us either with our phrasing or to kind of articulate these key concepts. I just wonder if we could ask, I'm thinking of Jerry and Kathayoon and Susan and Brian and Nettie and so many, I think, other folks on the call.
Yeah, yep, I hear that. We can absolutely do that. So what if we were to frame 3 possible pathways forward here and vote on how we want to do this, right? Are you with me on that? Can we do that? All right, so that means we've got to frame 3 possible pathways forward, doesn't it? So one possible pathway is for us to look across. Some of you used concept board, not all of you, but to look across the boards that you did use. Just spend a minute maybe looking at each one. I can share my screen and then start to pull out patterns across them. So that's one strategy. Another strategy would be to say, well, those boards are awesome, but maybe we just let them live there for right now. And maybe we have a conversation, right? We use chat or we actually, talk here. And I take some notes. I pull up a Word doc and I start taking some notes on the things that you all want to say about what is known and isn't known. And that can be sort of our master document. And then I think a third strategy might be closer to what Sarah is suggesting. Maybe it's a hybrid where I start a document, but where we either, start with or at some point hit pause and invite the researchers amongst us who really have spent a lot of time in the literature to help either seed or fertilize, depending on where we are. Does anyone want to suggest another pathway? Feel free to use chat, unmute, go for it. Thanks, Sarah. Yep, look across the boards and notes to pull out key themes. 2, just talk it out. And 3, invite some of our research colleagues to begin, and then the rest of us can continue to fill in. Okay, and the voting has started. I love it. 3. You can hear my dog upstairs. I don't know what he's voting for. 2, 1, then 3. Okay, I'm seeing lots of 3s. Keep going. If you haven't told me, democracy, not chatocracy. Brian, are you willing to say a little bit more about what that means? Where are you? I need to see you.
No, I just, this is welcome to 2020, right? Where everyone votes by putting something into the chat in a Zoom conference. So
I hear that. I really do. I viscerally lament the loss of us all being together in a room where we could have, papers and stickies and stuff on the wall and physically manipulate things. Count all the vote. Okay, I am seeing lots of 3s. Does anyone want to create an argument for not starting that way? I mean, for me, it does have, as someone who hasn't isn't an expert in this field, it does mean that we're starting with with some authority, right? I want to make sure people feel okay about that and that it's still going to feel like an inclusive process for all of you. Okay, you know what? If you're able to come on camera just for a second, I would love it. If you're not, I totally understand. And we're going to vote the way my daughter's 7th grade class votes. Are you ready? Everyone close your eyes. Close your eyes so you can't see what everyone else is voting for. I know this is super goofy, but just humor me. Close your eyes. And I want you to show me with number of fingers which approach you want to take here. Number 1 is looking across the boards, pulling out themes, so more of an emergent bottom-up approach. Number 2 is just talking it out, free for all. Number 3 is starting with the people in this room who have deep research experience and filling in after that. Everyone hold up your fingers, 1, 2, or 3, and leave them held up and your eyes closed for just a minute so that I can look across my multiple screens and see which and what you are advocating for. Okay, cool. Thank you all very much. You'll have to trust me when I say this because you didn't get to see it, but there's a clear majority for number 3. So I'm going to say that we move forward that way with an escape hatch, okay? The escape hatch is that as we do this, no recounts, no, not happening. As we do this, you should feel free to type into the chat at any point, like pause or stop, or, you know, can we regroup or something if this is starting to feel not right. Will you promise me that you'll do that? All right, cool. One was robbed. All right. I'm wondering if I have some thoughts, and Sarah has shared some thoughts on who we might start with here. So what if, let's see, Kathayoon, are you
here
willing to share with us? Hold on, let me get a Word doc open here so I can type. Well, so let me actually ask you all this before I do that, before I share. Do you want to see the Word doc going as I type, or do you want to see each other? Yeah, right. Yeah, that just occurred to me. Why the hell would you want to see me type? I mean, you know, it's fun in real time, but okay. So I'm going to type in the background here while you all are talking. Okay, thank you, everyone. We've got a process. Here we go. Let's start with Kathayoon. If you were going to answer the question, what do we think we know from research on empathy and conservation? What would you say?
Okay, well, this is like a little dissertation defense right here.
I know, but you can do it.
So I would say the main things that we feel like we know well and use in our practice include, first of all, the 3 different kinds of empathy. So cognitive, affective, and motivational empathy. Those kinds of empathies trigger, and thank you, Johnny, it will just be the abstract, trigger in different parts of...
Also, BTW, Johnny, you're next, so get ready.
Trigger in different parts of our brain. So you can understand the perspective of another, you can feel what you perceive the other person or animal as feeling, and you can be motivated to do something on behalf of another, either to relieve the suffering of another or to prolong the happiness or joy. We call that positive empathy. Yep. So we know that those 3 different kinds of empathy exist and can be differentially triggered or elicited within our visitors. We also know that there are several characteristics of animals that more closely lend themselves to eliciting empathic reactions, right? So this is why so many of our conversations are about feeling empathy for great apes or mammals that are closer to us, or just mammals in general. We know that those 4 characteristics include agency. So does the animal seem like they are doing things to fill their own needs? Does affectivity or mobility, does the animal have a face? Does it look like something that emotes? And if not, we conflate affectivity with mobility. So like animal moving, happy, animal sitting still, sad. Anyone who has big cats at their facility knows exactly what I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. Coherence. So does the animal look like an animal? I can show you a picture of a pangolin, and you readily accept that to be an animal with animal parts, because it has a face and eyes, and specifically the eyes are a big one. And then continuity, how much time is spent with the animal, that influences, the extent to which people readily empathize. There are also barriers, a lot of different barriers that affect our ability to empathize, including cultural stigmas, social norms, projection. Although Carol Saunders, says very interestingly that all empathy is projection to some extent. So that's something to noodle about. Environmental cues, things like that may inhibit our ability to feel empathy. And then we know about the behavior change landscape. We know about lots of different theories and frameworks for behavior change. And we understand generally that empathy is an internal or intrinsic motivator for sustaining or for, engaging in behavior change or in actions. And that's really important because that helps us to differentiate between some of the behaviors that might be a better fit for empathy and some of the behaviors that may not. And the last thing I'll say about that is that we also know about moral disengagement and the ability of humans to boomerang or retract back into themselves when they feel like they are given an overload of emotion without a productive outlet or an outlet that they perceive to be part of a solution. And so that is a line that we constantly walk, and something that is very interesting to delve into a little bit more, but we do know that that comes into play when thinking about conservation work.
Well done. Okay.
Oh, we know things about anthropomorphism.
And with that, you all get a PhD.
Yes, we'll have to keep counting how many PhDs we're handing out today. All right, Johnny Fraser, tell me what we know from research on empathy and conservation, please.
Oh, okay, so half the problem is Kathayoon took all the good licks. I'm going to say that a few pieces that I think are worth talking about in terms of empathy and conservation is that empathy can also be a metastasizing emotional state, in that when we look at things like spay-neuter release programs, which are really about empathy for a cat, even though it has theoretically going to reduce breeding, can lead to larger feral cat populations, even though they're going to eventually decline. That is still just, decimating the bird populations. So, the idea of culling programs or programs that require an individual to be lost to the system in order to protect the system, such as deer, can lead to things like chronic wasting disease. So when we look at things like human dimensions of wildlife and start looking at how people weigh the live and let live values that go with empathy, we find ourselves in tension in the conservation world. I was also saying in our breakout that I'll bring to the larger group, we know quite a bit about empathy development through the people that have been doing interventions to deal with animal abuse and animal risk, specifically incarcerated youth and their exposure to tractable animals like dogs or horses, things that they are able to interact with and develop an emotional relationship that takes over time. I think a lot of our work has started with a positive frame. And I think that we could do a lot more to look at some of the negatives, to look at where our risks are in use of empathy. Secondly, I think there is a deficit in the literature that looks at the transformation of empathy into systemic thinking and how where that bridge or tipping point is. What we see is that some people get stuck in empathy. And lastly, I think that there are some issues around empathy that can actually promote negative misconstrual. And, we need to be careful with when we have empathy for individuals when you're dealing with a hive-based life form. So we know, and this goes to some of the work David Shepherdson did some years ago on, thinking about hive life, thinking about collective life. What is health of an anchovy ball, right? Like, we're not talking about one individual. Thank you, Nicole, for having that with you. So when we talk about things like fish or any species that exists in sort of a collective, that is in that place of abstraction that Kathayoon was mentioning that I think we could do a lot more to think about. So that's a quick summary.
You now have 2 PhDs apparently. Will you say more
Mine's
about, you said
come on.
there's You said there's a deficit in the literature on the transformation of empathy into systemic thinking. Will you say more about that? What is systemic thinking in that?
When you look at the work that Wes Schultz did around 2000 to 1998 to 2004, he was looking at the how we could categorize people based on the sort of degree they move from egoism to the conference of inclusion in their system, or the expansion of their scope of justice. Susan Apatow has also done some work on this concept of scope of justice, and I think that where it tips is when I say I care about the individual and I may regret what is going to happen to the individual, but the loss of the individual is necessary to achieve that for the system. We see that those break so tightly in the literature that you are one or the other. It's not like ego to altruism, ego to empathy for others, the ability to perspective take. The ability to perspective take and feel regret while accepting the euthanasia of an animal for the greater good is a complicated tipping point. And certainly with human models, that becomes really problematic because that is used in abusive settings for things like promoting social discord, racism. It's sort of the function of how the Holocaust happens, right? The othering that distances someone from empathy. And so, and we continue to see that work even in, the other great genocides. So I don't think we've done a good job of thinking about how we can still take that level of empathy while managing the promotion of conservation of nature and natural systems. And I do, I'm going to add to this one that what we know from zoos and aquariums is that the user of these institutions is arriving predisposed to want to care, predisposed to carry with them an ethic of empathetic concern for other beings and nature and an attachment to nature. But also as part of that, their narrative tends to be a live and let live, hands-off approach, which is where it becomes problematic in what's called the mutualist narrative if you apply the USDA model of wildlife values orientations.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay, now I stop.
Awesome. What about Jerry? Is there anything that you would add, having heard this rapid fire synthesis from Kathayoon and Johnny?
Oh, they covered everything. I mean, Johnny, it's even tougher following you.
And I just want to say here before Jerry, this will give you a second to collect your thoughts too. Note in the chat that there are some requests to use smaller words. What I interpret that to mean is if it's possible to put some of this knowledge of the research into more of a layperson vocabulary wherever you're able to do that would be awesome. So no pressure now, Jerry.
All right, well, a little bit of maybe what we know and what we don't know.
Okay, go for it.
And that is how Kathayoon talked about, well, cognitive empathy and affective empathy. And how do they really work together? On the cognitive side, we have interpretation and talking with people and getting them interested, showing, connections between them and nature and so on. Yep. On the other hand, affective empathy, I think, deals more with observing the animals, getting a close-up view, getting eye to eye with a lion. And how do those two kind of interact to really motivate someone, if they're willing to be motivated in the first place, which is another big question. But again, more on the affective empathy side, a really more positive empathy. We've seen recent research, I'm working with Woodland Park Zoo. There's a strong correlation between perceptions of animal welfare and empathy. And the more people see that the animals are being taken care of, their good welfare, their empathetic reactions are much greater. Does one cause the other? We don't know, but they are.
Will you repeat that? Will you repeat that for me? I missed that one.
When people see animals, zoo, aquarium animals, being well taken care of, good care, good welfare. The exhibits are clean.
Yep.
There's an enrichment tool, you know, what have you. We're seeing them, their empathetic reactions are much stronger.
Okay.
So again, it's a correlation. We don't know what's cause and effect. But again, looking at the opposite end, if they see that the animal, something is wrong, or they're feeling that they're not being cared for, their empathy goes down, which is kind of interesting to think about. But anyways, so again, my main point is, again, how the cognitive and affective work together to possibly motivate and then to continue on after the visit. That's a big question. But I think we need to really focus in on both ends, the cognitive empathy and the affective empathy. And they're two different sources. One is more of the interpretation, the other is more of observing the animals, close-up views, and so on.
Yep.
So that's what I have.
Okay, so thank you so much for doing that. I appreciate it. And we're starting to get some conversation happening in chat here, which I love and don't want to shut down, but we may not be able to deal with it right now. So maybe what you can do is continue to put your thoughts in chat. And what I'll do is after today is over, I'll pull those and also put them into this document so that we don't lose them. Is that fair? Okay, Linnea Johnson, can I put you on the spot for just a second? Are you willing to share what you know from your master's thesis work, please?
Absolutely, yeah. So my thesis work was really looking at a question of does empathy for animals correlate with environmental self-efficacy, which is essentially the conviction that one can successfully carry out meaningful actions individually or collectively on behalf of beings affected by threats to the natural world. And so this was very much built off of the work that Jerry has been doing, and the Shed Aquarium and Brookfield Zoo been working on an instrument to measure conservation learning. And what I found was that, yes, experiences of empathy for animals, both predispositional and the affective reactions experienced at zoos and aquariums are strongly correlated with self-efficacy and also with intent to act, which has been shown before, but this study kind of confirmed that that is the case. And I'll be happy to chat more with folks who are interested about this.
Thank you. Thanks so much for doing that. Okay, who else would like to contribute at this moment? Who else feels like either from your research or from an understanding of other people's research feels like you've got something to add?
Can I just say, for anyone that is working at zoos and all that, there's almost always a shortage of long-term studies on any subject, including empathy and all that kind of stuff. So if you can think of a way to monitor visitors over longer than just, hey, we did this program and they came and they saw for a week or whatever, if you have members or memberships or all that kind of stuff where you can actually track people for years, long-term research is almost always in short supply because it's so difficult to do. So think carefully about, hey, wait a minute, how might we be able to start up a program like that? Because we do have people that are coming and they're bringing their families and, over and over and over again. So any kind of projects that involve long-term would be useful to learn more about, for sure.
Thanks, Brian. And we'll look to you again tomorrow to bring that up. I think that that's a great example of how tomorrow we can start to identify where the gaps are, right? And hopefully then identify some preliminary research priorities here. Nettie, is there anything you would like to add to what has been said?
Well, just reacting to Brian's observation and really distilling everything that's been said down to like a super basic non-PhD level.
Yes, please.
We know that empathy can be measured.
Yes.
We know that increased empathy is correlated eventually, somehow, probably many different pathways, to that increased intent and willingness for conservation action. We also know that there are specific techniques that we can use in our teaching that would help to grow and develop and promote empathy for the learners. So those basic concepts drawn together would tell me that, hey, there is a way to design my program very intentionally around empathy outcomes. And if I do that, if I apply the research to my practice, then I can be fairly certain that my program does lead in some respect to the conservation action that is part of my organization's mission. So even
Awesome.
without having necessarily the long-term longitudinal research we all crave, it's a legitimate thing and an important thing to be doing.
Yes. Thanks, Nanny. What you just did there is a real skill, being able to take all of that and synthesize it into, 3 really important statements. We know that empathy can be measured. We know that increased empathy is correlated eventually to increased intent and willingness to take conservation action. And we know that there are specific techniques that we can use in our teaching to help grow and develop empathy for learners. Those are 3 really, I think, important claims to make. Is there anyone else?
Yeah, Jessica, I wouldn't mind just mentioning that a lot of what we seem to feel confident about in developing empathy in our guests about animals is through facilitated experiences. So through interpretation, through classrooms. And so I feel like we have a less of a handle on how we can do that in a non-facilitated experience. So if for a visitor who's coming through and experiencing an exhibit, maybe even reading a sign, but isn't necessarily having that opportunity to see the animal through the eyes of an interpreter or an instructor or a keeper, I think that there's a gap to understand that better.
Okay, love that. What else? Sarah's, oh, please.
Yeah, I want to say a couple words about related emotions, because this is something that comes up in measurement and also just in thinking about this, that empathy has a very specific definition, and there are a lot of related emotions like love, curiosity, respect, fear, admiration, awe, that are separate from empathy, but could be building blocks or are related. But I think that's really important when we think about some of these behaviors and what we're trying to enact, and thinking about it in terms of the, can you feel empathy for a species, right? And this is happening in the chat, but for anyone who's not on a computer, who's on their phone or whatever, it is really hard, nay, impossible to feel empathy for an entire species. We feel empathy for individuals, but that does not mean that we can't feel love, respect, admiration, fear, blah, 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 for an entire species. And so I think it's important to think about how these related emotions interact, and how they may build on one another or not.
And Kathayoon, I would also argue that at some point, functionally, advancement of this becomes a diminishing return for the conservation goal, that we need people to be at a threshold level that we're looking for in society. So, if all of the aquariums and zoos got together and created one more Dalai Lama, that won't save the world.
Johnny, I don't understand your point there yet. What are you saying?
I'm saying that we have a threshold level of empathy that is valuable for us in the effort to expand conservation outcomes. But at some point, we've got people that if I care about most critters, maybe that's good enough. And we can just say, our goal is to move people from empathy to action. And we need to look at where is that threshold where we have diminishing returns, because we know that our volunteers have a great deal of empathy for the critters in our care. And do we need to help them grow more empathy, or are they really helpful as part of our family, moving those who are not quite at our level forward?
Yeah, that's the empathy hammer idea, right? That empathy is not the right tool for every audience, for every circumstance, for every situation. So I think being strategic and understanding when empathy and developing empathy is appropriate and productive, as to your point, Johnny, is important.
Okay, awesome. I want to just pause for a second and acknowledge some of these comments that are happening in the chat. So Sarah Brenkert is asking, do we know if empathy should be considered a finite emotional resource? That is, if I feel empathy for my neighbor, do I have less in the tank, less left to give for my spouse? Does anyone have knowledge of that?
I might be asking for my spouse. He might want to know that.
Yeah, all of our spouses might, or partners, or, you know, people in our houses.
So quickly, the answer is there is not a finite limit of empathy to give out like little, you know, blocks. People have the ability to confer in that scope of justice greater and greater empathy. What we see though is when I elicit empathy, it diminishes as it goes across multiple samples of the same thing, which is difficult.
It diminishes,
right?
as it goes across multiple samples of the same thing.
Right. One animal suffering, I have great empathy for it. I see two suffering, it's something else. So you know this in the Save the Children program, right? They stop putting multiple kids with, you know, who are starving on the TV because they only use one child, because if they have more than one child, they reduce their returns. And
doesn't that suggest that empathy is in fact finite?
Against a target that I don't know. So I don't have a limit when it is somebody I know, my cat, my neighbor, my spouse. But it's different when you give me a third party who I don't know personally and imagine to be suffering or imagining to be happy, right?
Thank you.
But also, sorry, Kathayoon, I was just going to reference you anyway. But, you know, animals that have a smile or a neotenous appearance are going to elicit more empathy. So I'll get more empathy for pandas, multiple pandas. Whereas if I look at a dolphin, I'm going to have some more empathy. But when I start looking at other, you know, sharks, my empathy is already starting at a lower level.
Okay, what about, oh, sorry, Kathayoon.
I was going to say, I like that transition of, I was going to reference you when I think about animals that smile and have a neotenous expression.
Yeah, there, you know, I think of you and pandas in the same bucket. Yeah, I don't know.
I was going to say,
Quokka.
This comes up a lot in animal care too, this idea of compassion fatigue. When you, or just emotional fatigue, right? That there is only so much grieving that can be done. There is only so much, you know, emotional energy that can be put into a relationship with another individual or animal or whatever. And I think that is not, we should not overlook that, right? Because that is very, very real. And I think that does speak to some finiteness of empathy. It's not like blocks, right? But that like, within ourselves, we can grow that over time, like how much, you know.
Oh, but that, okay, but you're talking about emotional labor here.
Okay.
I have a limited amount of emotional labor that I can do before I am exhausted. It is not a limit to my empathy.
Let me just put a pin in that, because I know that probably the two of you could talk about this all day, and that's a different fishbowl. Many of us would love to watch that fishbowl too. So there was another question in here somewhere about, can there be oversaturation of empathy? So we've acknowledged that we all have infinite amounts of empathy for things and people that we know. Some of it starts to diminish when we have to spread it across third-party people that or things that we don't know as well. But is there a true saturation point? Do we know that?
I do not.
Awesome.
I'll share. I just read an interesting study to this point when I was exploring the differences in outcomes between positive empathy and negative empathy. And it's outside the scope of conservation studies. It's within the realm of healthcare, but there was a study that showed that empathy fatigue in healthcare providers or healthcare workers could actually be mitigated or prevented by matching the amount of negative empathy that they're experiencing in their careers and jobs every day with positive empathetic experiences. So if they are feeling empathy for someone else's suffering at a consistent rate, increasing the exposure they have to empathetic joy or these sort of positive empathy experiences actually reduced or sort of balanced out such that they weren't feeling that empathetic fatigue at the same level and had higher satisfaction in their jobs.
I love that because it's also required for our work, because we don't want people to look at the animals in our care and see them as suffering, but we might want them to see their wild counterparts as suffering. So that to balance the empathy work that we do with sort of more positive approaches, as in we want to extend the health of the wild populations to match the good health and care that the animals in our care experience. I think that speaks to that important balance.
And I think the agency part is really big there too, which goes back to one of the original things I was mentioning, that, you know, picking behaviors and audiences with which there is agency to act on the empathy and turn it into something productive, the negative empathy especially, that we know that to be more effective as a pathway.
Okay, I want to hit pause here for a second. This is amazingly rich, and I think I've captured much of it and look forward to bringing it back to you tomorrow. But I do, and I am committed to pulling from what's happening here in the chat too. But I do want to acknowledge that many of us in this group right now are not researchers and have come to this topic from a different perspective. And so I want to open up an avenue for you to contribute here as well. Are there things from your practice related to empathy that you feel like, you know, you're not sure if it's necessarily supported by research, but you feel like it's a pretty common practice, or you feel like it's pretty intuitive and it works well? Is there anything from practice that any of you want to offer up here?
I guess we had a question in our small group session. If when someone comes to your facility and you tell them or thank them for coming to your facility because they supported conservation, if that has actually been studied and if that actually does make them want to do more, or if it doesn't actually do anything. And we were talking about it in our small group, but I didn't know if anyone knew if there was actual research on that they could pull from, or if it's just not really known yet.
Okay. Emily is saying that their group had the same conversation. Does anyone know anything related to that question? So that might be another point of conversation.
Can't provide the citations. I recall it somewhere. So it definitely comes out of consumer service and consumer retention. So yeah, it's not, Sarah, thank you, conservation communication, but I think it actually is consumer psychology that will find a lot of those sort of thank yous and appreciations and relationship building. If you look at relationship marketing, a lot of that has to do with thank you, you know, talking to people as if they're guests, when it's like, I'm not a guest, I'm a customer. I'm just trying to, you know, buy a Band-Aid. I don't need to be your guest. So, you know, it can play both ways, but it's been definitely, the research is there, but I think it's a little out of date in terms of how it's been misused recently.
Okay, that's good to know.
But I'm sorry, I'm Googling my brains out here.
I'm from the building world, and promoting empathy in the building world is minimal. And so you guys talking about empathy and working with people as they come into zoos and aquariums is so very important, and also giving examples on how they can relate in their daily lives on depending on what house or property they purchase, products, all the building world examples, because I deal with a lot of people. I say, well, what about these trees? We need to save them. There's habitat. It's very difficult to try someone that has a view of the lake to keep those trees. And so I think really educating people to have empathy towards animals and habitat when it comes to the dollar or to their view is super, super critical. And to work on them in a non-confrontational world like a zoo or an aquarium, so much easier than me being faced with them standing on their property trying to help them understand why they shouldn't cut down a tree or flatten their property to get rid of all the millions of things that are living on their property. So I just wanted to encourage you guys. You guys are doing such an amazing job, and I really appreciate this group. And keep up the phenomenal work. And I wouldn't be here as a sustainable architect today if it wasn't for my experiences at zoos and aquariums and that sort of thing as a kid. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Great comment. All right, I don't want to unnecessarily stop this conversation, but I do also want to acknowledge that this has been a very intense and productive 4 hours, and that we might be reaching our saturation point here. Someone in the chat asked is there a way to preserve all of this so that we can reference it post-conference? Yeah, so it's my understanding that the aquarium staff are super committed to having some things in writing that come out of this, and that they are willing to share those. I don't know exactly what they're going to look like, but again, we've got your concept boards. We've got now a Word doc that's going. We'll continue to document tomorrow in the spirit of full transparency and generosity. All right. I want to thank each and every one of you for being here, for staying here, for leaning in when it got a little bit awkward and hard, for being put on the spot and summarizing things that you know deep in the recesses of your brain, for listening to other people share what they know, for pushing forward with virtual fatigue. I'm truly grateful, and I know the aquarium staff are too. I hope that you do something this afternoon or this evening that has nothing to do with any of this, right? Let's binge watch some crappy Netflix or go for a walk or do something, and then come back tomorrow and we'll review, we'll take stock of where we are, and we will figure out how to best use our time tomorrow. Is that fair? Awesome. Sarah, Jim, is there anything else you want to say before we part ways? I think there's a happy hour that happens.
There is. So at 2:30 on Pacific time, we would love it if you wanted to Zoom back in and join us. It's the same Zoom link that you used to access this meeting. Maybe you have, if you received one of the conference coasters, you would like to showcase your conference coaster and a beverage of your choice. Or if you are mixologing an empathy mocktail or cocktail, I believe that Jim Wharton will be bringing and demonstrating the empathy hammer in the happy hour. We would love to see you all. We also recognize it's been a long day. And so we'd also just love to see you tomorrow morning, bright and early.
I will certainly be demonstrating drinking the empathy hammer, but yeah, and I also want to thank everybody for your participation and as Jesse said, leaning in. I think that this is the one thing that we've discovered about when we've done workshops about empathy is that it's not the content by itself that's productive, but it's processing it with each other and thinking and talking about it and examining how we think and feel about it, that where the real sort of magic happens. So thank you for leaning into making this as interactive as we possibly could, and there'll be more of that tomorrow.
Thanks, everyone. Bye. Have a good rest of your day, evening.